is a psychologist and teaches psychology in the Behavioral Sciences Department at the Santa Rosa Junior College. He is a former Dean of Faculty and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Saybrook Institute. And he has very many interesting publications on specific interesting topics like Old Norse mythology, modern consciousness and indigenous wisdom, trance, and even the symbol of bear, based on his visit in Lapland. And he also published with Stanley Krippner on hypnotic-like procedures in indigenous shamanism and mediumship. So please, we are listening to your presentation.
Thank you, Kata, and thank you so much for arranging all of this, and thank you, Günther. Thank you, everybody who's helping here to make this happen. I am going to talk about shamanic selves, neuropsychology, and the future of healing. And what you see here in the background of the slides is this image by a Native American painter. And it's a little bit an introduction to my topic. The painter's name is Norval Morrisseau, and he was an Anishinaabe painter. And what you see here is a person up there on the left, and if you follow it, the person transforms into a thunderbird or an eagle. So this is an introduction to the topic of how personality, for example, is understood differently in different cultures. This all started out for me, this inquiry, with a question that my Native American colleague, Apila Colorado, asked me, "Who are you?" And as she asked me, "Who are you?" she didn't just ask for my name or my profession or education or anything of that nature. She was really asking for my cultural identity. She was asking me, how do you relate to my native mind? Are you in your Western mind? Are you a colonizer? She was asking those kinds of questions. So that led me to an inquiry into who we are, how our personalities work, and what individuality is. I want to say just a little bit about the context of my presentation. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I was trained in humanistic and transpersonal psychologies and psychotherapies, bioenergetics, but also behavioral cognitive therapy. Done a fair amount of work with indigenous peoples, particularly with the Sami up in the European Arctic, and with the Native Americans in the southwest of the US, as well as in California. This all has led me to an approach that I use with my students back home, which I call ethno-autobiography, meaning using autobiographical writing to inquire about your identity and to critically reflect about your identity. I said I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but at times I call myself jokingly a deviant psychologist because I'm also really interested in anthropology, philosophy, epistemology, so I'm really very much a transdisciplinary person. And actually at times I give presentations on how psychology has taken a wrong turn by focusing so much on the individual and so little on the socio-cultural context. I also very often bring in, and you will see this in this presentation, historical perspectives, how things have developed. Working with indigenous peoples, decolonization has become a focus. What does that mean? What does it mean for indigenous peoples today? But also, what does it mean for somebody who's white like me, who's not indigenous? My basic paradigm is one of a scientific, what I would call a scientific pluralism that is based in an indigenous paradigm. And I'll say a little bit about that later on, but it's not the focus of this presentation. I want to just highlight that when I'm talking about indigenous peoples, when I talk about all these issues, I'm German, but I live in the US, so much of what I'm saying comes out of the US context, and that's very important to keep in mind. And my work with Native Americans has greatly influenced my thinking. So these are the three broad topics that I'm going to talk about, particularly the differences between the indigenous and the modern self process. I'm going to talk about the history of the neuropsychological process, changes in the way we human beings are using our brains, how that has changed over time. And I'm going to talk some about shamanic healing and the future of healing. I bring in basically three perspectives, one coming from personality theory, then neuropsychology, and then indigenous thinking or an indigenous perspective. And I look from these different vantage points on the construction or the self process, on the construction of the self or the process of the self, particularly the differences between indigenous or native or aboriginal self and the modern self. So what you find here is my basic argument that native cultures embody a balanced use of the brain through ceremonial and everyday life practices which result in a specific indigenous self process. And with that, I also suggest that that is somewhat different from the modern self process, meaning European traditions have increasingly trained a predominantly left hemispheric use of the brain, which created the masterful, well-boundaried modern self and enabled colonialism and technological development. And so if we are looking toward how we do healing and where healing works and where healing doesn't work, I think we need to look towards a balanced use of our brain. We need to use a pluralistic scientific approach, and we need to use pluralistic multimodal approaches to healing, and that's kind of what Michael also talked about in his presentation. So my basic interest is, what can we learn from shamanism to address our contemporary crises? I'm not so much interested in looking back. I'm very much interested in looking forward. What can we take from it? What can we learn from it to address things where we are not doing so well? And of course, the same applied to the area of healing. So let me talk about the self, personality, individuality. You know, here are the functions of the self, and I use the terms self, personality, individuality somewhat interchangeably in my presentations. And we can have self-knowledge, introspection, integrate knowledge about the outside world. We present ourselves in particular ways. We can control how we present ourselves. And we also can give reasons why we are doing certain things in a particular way. It's very important to see that a self does not exist in any isolation, but culture and self make each other up. They are interdependent, and there is a great variety of variation among cultures, many differences, and different qualities of self. And I sort of map them into three broad categories, which are really not discrete categories, but which is really a continuous scale. And just to highlight these, here you might say you have an indigenous presentation of the self in this painting. And what you will probably notice is you know, here's the person, but the person is actually kind of a little hard to see, you know, with a bird on top, and other birds, and, you know, a tree or flowers or fruit, and more birds. So the person is enmeshed in the natural world, embedded in the natural world. Now here we have the total opposite, a somewhat sarcastic or cynical description of the modern self by the South African Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee, from the book Diary of a Bad Year. The title, the book lives up to its title. It's all dark in the book, 250 wonderful pages of darkness. And here he says, pride in the mechanical mode seems to be uniquely American, for in America, the model of the self as a ghost inhabiting a machine goes almost unquestioned at a popular level. The body, as conceived in America, the American body, is a complex machine comprising a vocal module, a sexual module, and several more, even a psychological module. Inside the body machine, the ghostly self checks readouts and taps keys, giving commands which the body obeys. So this is kind of a satirical description of the modern self. Psychologists like Kenneth Gergen have started to talk about the postmodern self and what that might mean. And what he's talking about is that we're now in a process where we can constantly construct and reconstruct ourselves. Think Facebook, right? You can present your identity differently. You can change it. You can put up new photos. So anything that can be negotiated goes. So each reality of self gives way to reflexive questioning, irony, and ultimately the playful probing of yet another reality. So there's a lot of play, and you can see that when you look what people are doing on Facebook pages. Now, he has a negative comment here when he says, the center fails to hold. You know, where's the center in all of this? Because it's a sense of identity that is very different from the modern self. You can summarize this: I am connected, therefore I exist. Or the French sociologist Baudrillard, he talks about the self as terminal of multiple networks, right? Now, what has happened here is that the unified sense of the self has kind of transformed into the many potentials that play with each other. And everything is always shifting. We can shift as we engage in different environments. So, there's an interesting similarity between an indigenous self process and a postmodern self process, which is a fluidity, right? In indigenous societies, we find initiations, the sense of identities, the names of people may change during the course of life. So there's a certain fluidity as people go through rituals and ceremonies, with a lot of differences between different cultures. But what is different is that in indigenous societies, there's a groundedness in the cultural story that gives a very clear container. When we are the terminal of multiple networks, the question is, where is the groundedness, or where is the container? And that is an open question. Let me talk briefly about two poles here: an interdependent sense of self, or a sociocentric sense of self, and an independent or individualistic sense of self. Now I'm going to talk in very broad brush strokes. There are a lot of generalizations, which also means that within each of these categories there's a lot of variations. Somebody may be in a society that's very individualistic, say in the US, but come from a family that has a more interdependent view. So there's a lot of variation in there. So let me go through this. So in the independent view of the self, we define ourselves in terms of our thoughts and feelings and actions, independence and uniqueness, individuality is valued. And part of growing up is becoming an individual, demonstrating your individuality. And we define ourselves as separate from other people. We feel comfortable when we're praised. That's something good. Happiness is entirely dependent on me, on the trajectory of my life, the decisions that I make. Myself has very clear boundaries. And my close relationships have little to do, not that much to do with how I feel about myself. I determine, I am in charge. Now, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz notes that this is actually a rather peculiar construction of the self, and it's rather unique. The interdependent pole is kind of the opposite, meaning we define ourselves in terms of relationships. We recognize that the thoughts and feelings of others, our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are determined by others. When we are very independent or very unique, when we stand out, that can easily be a problem. I remember in the Pueblo cultures in the southwest of the US, there was a woman who was a painter. She started out painting in the traditional design, pottery design, and then as her painting took off, she developed her own style. And she was scolded for that because it was different from the tradition. She was deviating from the tradition, and because it was too individual. So at the interdependent pole, families and social groups are important. We're interconnected. The sense of self is more porous, and independence and uniqueness may be frowned upon. Here are some statements that somebody on the interdependent pole might agree with. My close relationships are an important reflection of who I am. When I think of myself, I often think of my close friends or family also. If a person hurts someone close to me, I feel personally hurt as well. So those are some descriptors. Here's a little bit of a alternate language terminology that I'm giving you, individualism versus collectivism. And to that, I want to add the term indigenism, meaning that relationships are not just, individuality is not just defined in terms of the relationships within the group, but also in terms of the relationship with the place, the mythology, the rituals, the relationship with the ancestors. So that is a specific formation of the interdependent pole. And of course, dreams are something that are very important in those societies where we find indigenous interdependence. That is really how the majority of societies, cultures, civilizations defined their identity, where story, song, beliefs, traditional folk wisdom, rituals, ceremonial objects, costumes, and potions, they would be part of defining, interacting with who the person is, and that would be used to solve problems of imbalance, problems of illness, and would be part of the identity process of the person. I use these terms interchangeably. Different countries use different terms. In Canada, people talk about Aboriginal people. In the US, people talk about Native people. And what I'm talking about is not just Native people of the past or Indigenous people of the past, but also the present. And especially in the US, you find very often that people say, oh, there are no Native people here. and they live right outside of town, and people just don't know about them. So, the self, which is a noun, it should really be a verb, because the self is a process. When we're saying, well, what is your authentic self? It's not a thing that we can find. It is a process that we can be true to. So, and Michael just talked a lot about process on observing and changes and impermanence, and that is also, applies to the sense of self. Of course, in indigenous societies, we find that the sense of self gets also marked through initiation rites, rites of passage, memberships in medicine societies, etc. And Gerald Wisner, a famous Native American intellectual and novelist, insists that indigenous peoples have always been postmodern, meaning in a state of fluidity where things were always moving. Here you have a chart of sort of the three differences. On the left, the individualistic societies, and you'll see the acronym WEIRD there, which I will talk a little bit about, which has a certain provocative ring. And on the right, you have the indigenous societies, and in the center, you have collectivist or communal societies, or you might say Asian societies. Now, what I'm saying here about weird cultures is based on a review of the literature that the three authors listed below did. It comes out of psychology. And this sense of identity, this sense of self, is actually the least representative of humanity. And this refers to Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And it's, of course, part of the independent or individualistic view of the self. And its exemplars you kind of find on the East Coast, and you find it particularly on the East Coast of the US in university cities. The weirder you are, the more you see a world of separate objects rather than relationships, okay? So that is the quality of the self. And if you remember the first image that I showed you of the person embedded with the birds and the tree, right? Very different sense, where things are taken apart analytically. A very important contribution in terms of looking at the self in Western psychology is the book by Phil Cushman. The title is Constructing the Self, Constructing America. And he looked at the history of the modern self in the US and how it actually became so powerful and seen as so independent. And what happened historically is when the settlers arrived, they saw the Native Americans as primitive, so they couldn't identify with them. They couldn't see any culture, civilization, anything in there, so they wanted to be different, right? And of course, they also couldn't identify with the slaves that were brought into the US, right? So what happened is that and they didn't want to have anything to do, very often, with the traditions that they came from in Europe, because they were discriminated, persecuted there. They were trying to get away from that trauma, right? So there are sort of three disconnections, you might say. So the self, the center of the self, was empty, okay? It couldn't be based on these three options, really. And so there is an absence of community, tradition, and shared meaning. And that has created problems, and really it's the foundation of consumerism in the US, because that is what fills the empty self, whether that's Hollywood, whether that's buying electronics, or whatever it is. So there are a lot of absences in that self and no connections with tradition. I use the term normative dissociation. By that, I refer to a splitting from those parts of the self that the indigenous sense of self generally is naturally connected to, such as place, such as ancestors, such as ancestral spirits, a history, a mythic history, ritual, right? That we are disconnected from, that we are dissociated from. And normative, of course, means it is the norm that people in modern Western weird societies, you might say, do not have these connections. So these are sort of terms that I use a little bit interchangeably, particularly when I talk about the US. To get students' attention, I talk about white consciousness and the white mind, and then they always go, what, white mind? And I talk about whiteness not in terms of ethnicity, but really as a state of consciousness. It signifies a state of consciousness because when you scratch at whites, they all have different ethnicities, they all have different histories, they all have different origins, right? And part of what I do in some of my seminars is I ask students to investigate their ethnic origins, their ancestral origins, and to deal with the history of the disconnections. Here you have some graphic charts of the independent view where you can see, here is the individual in the center. The circles just touch, and the strangers are outside of the basic circle there. Here you have the interdependent view where you see the overlap, right? So the center of the self, the individual, is porous, and you see the broken lines here, right? So it's a very different sense of self here. You can compare the two, and it's a nice graphic presentation. And again, we're mapping things here. So we're talking in broad generalizations. Here you see that individualism, of course, we find here to a somewhat lesser extent in Europe, with Great Britain a little higher than the rest of Europe, Australia, while individualism is very low here in South America, here in Pakistan, etc. So one of the things you may ask, is this just a sort of a philosophical interpretation of psychology or what's going on here? Interestingly, brain research now shows that this is also reflected in a brain process. You will notice that when I talk about neuropsychology, I always talk about things are reflected. Things may be reflected in culture, things may be reflected in neuropsychology. I'm saying it that way because I don't think neuropsychology provides ultimate explanations. Because we as human beings consist of multiple dimensions, and neuropsychology cannot provide us with an ultimate explanation. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Here's something interesting that we found in functional MRIs. In the interdependent view, this is with a Chinese and a Western sample, we find the same brain activation patterns when they're thinking about themselves and when they think about their mother. The same areas of the brain light up, right? Which is, given the theory that I've just given you, is what you would expect, right? While in the independent view, there are two different patterns of activation in the brain. So there is a biological reflection of these cultural practices and habits of the self. Okay? Now, I want to emphasize there is a great diversity of indigenous cultures, many, many different, whether you are talking Siberia, whether you're talking Native Americans, whether you talk Aboriginals in Australia, great differences, but what is a common quality is that the sense of self is connected or embedded in place, myth, ritual, ancestors, spirits, right? Those are qualities that you pretty much find overall besides the general qualities of the interdependent view, meaning a connection with a community. Here you actually, this is a chart that Juha Pentikainen developed, yes, of the Old Norse worldview. You have the Tree of Life. You have a shaman, which of course shaman has nothing to do with man or woman. It's a Tungus or Evenki term that has to do with somebody who sees or somebody who, is energized, heats up the energies, connected to the upper world, the North Star, and the lower world embedded in the community. Here you see what look like Sami, Lavus, and reindeer. So here you have the embedded sense of self. This is sort of a reconstructed view of where I grew up. This is what Hamburg looked like 20,000 years ago, right in the Paleolithic. And you actually have here 3 offering poles, which are female, which are over 2 meters high. They're standing there, where people would make their offerings. And of course, at that time, reindeer were roaming along the river Elbe, right? Very different climate at that time. Here you have a sand painting from the Dene. Many of you may know them as Navajos. And what I want to point out here is the place of emergence. Here is the center of the world. It's held together by a rainbow figure. And you can see that there is a balance with the 4 directions here. In the corners, you have maize plants or corn plants. And here's a little poetic description of this worldview. The scene is ancient, but the time is today. In the center of the circle, in the middle of the sand painting, sits the Navajo Indian patient. So when somebody gets treatment, they actually get placed in the middle of the sand painting. And this very elaborate sand painting gets done only for this one occasion and gets destroyed right after that, taken out to the north, offered to the ancestors. So the patient sits right in the center, right by the place of emergence or on the place of emergence, ready to be recreated from the beginning point. And that's the Navajo philosophy. You live your life, you go out of balance, you get sick. So what you need to do is you kind of need to be reborn and recreate yourself in balance. And that's what these ceremonies do. And these ceremonies last anywhere from 3 to 9 days, right? And a day is actually a night. The ceremonies start at sunset and end at sunrise. So they recreate themselves from the place of emergence. The circle of the rainbow person in pink and light blue all around him, holding him in the circle, prayer sticks placed all around, intentions for healing. Each prayer stick has a prayer in it, an intention for healing. 13 stand-up prayer sticks with feathers in each direction, a pair of gods, between them a corn plant, 4 corn plants in different colors. That's what you see here that I pointed out earlier. And here you actually, on the left, you see the sand painting and the Hata'ali, the singer. Navajos don't call them medicine people even, or shamans. They talk about singers, because these are called chantways. And putting on the body painting on the child here, who then will be placed on this painting. I see the Navajo cosmos in this sand painting. The patient plays in ceremony in a balanced world so that it may shift his imbalance, his illness. The Navajo patient sits at the center of his cosmos, his self held by the powers of the 4 directions, by the powers of the 4 sacred mountains, the 4-leggeds in the mountains, the winged ones, the plants of the mountains. The self, a circle that is part of the Navajo cosmos. And what you see here in italics is an actual quote from the chant that they sing. This is from the Coyote Way. With the sons of sun he is moving. With the sons of white corn girl he is moving. With dark cattails on top he is moving. With a flash of lightning he is moving. With the black blossomed plant he is moving. The Navajo patient sits in a large circle of self. And here you can see the identification with all these different parts, right? You can see in the languaging how the sense of self is different. The white corn boy, it is I walking. Beneath the two rising on White Mountain, it is I walking. The yellow corn boy, it is I walking. Beneath the two setting on Yellow Mountain, it is I walking. The blue corn, it is I walking. Between the two on Blue Mountain, it is I walking. The black corn, it is I walking. Beneath where Big Dipper turns, it is I walking. With pollen, which is their blessing, it is I walking. Happiness before me, it is I walking. Happiness behind me, it is I walking. And of course, the spirits and what they call very often gods, that's how it's translated, are in balance, right? So through the identification with these spirits, the patient gets healed. Hojong is their central term, which means beauty or balance. Their central phrase is Sa'anagai Hojong, which means growing old in beauty, growing old in balance. And it's a phrase that has a female and a male part. And the female part has a male and a female part. And the male part has a male and a female part, right? So it indicates total balance. And that's the Navajo worldview. And you can see how this sense of self is very different from our modern sense of self. You find the same thing here with the Sami people of the Arctic. This is from a poem by Niels Aslak, Valkeapää, shaman, artist, that the Sami people give the call by the honorific Ailohash, Baby, Mail Miachchi, the sun, the world's father, Eanan Githanieda, the earth spring's daughter, Almirau Tagolaraset, Haisuinit, Hulahanan Etnama. The horizon's gold flower, the fragrant grass, I converse with the earth. And this notion of conversation in one form or another you find in a number of traditions, and I could go on here, but I think you get the gist how the person, how he describes the Sami worldview in a very famous book that won the Nordic Prize for Literature, where he describes the Sami worldview both in images and in poetry. Okay. The Andean, and I shall not dare to pronounce the Quechua here, but they talk in the Andes about criar y dejarse criar, to nurture and let oneself be nurtured. So the self is in a cycle with the natural world, in conversation with the ancestral spirits, the other spirits, the spirits of the mountains, and there are mutual obligations, and it's a cycle and a circle and a constant ongoing exchange. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to move. How many minutes have I used? 18 minutes, okay. So I'm going to rush forward here, not talk about the Lakota. Here's in detail what you saw before, the transformation of a human into a thunderbird. And this is, of course, Norval Morrisseau himself sitting here. He had a major vision. He had a major initiatory illness, after which he assumed the name Copper Thunderbird. And you see him here gradually assuming the shape of the thunderbird. And here you have all these images together. Here, a nice one, you see here, here he's with the bear medicine, right? And you see, you can barely sort of see the face in here that is embedded in the presence of the bear. Okay, Very briefly, I want to reframe my discussion and use the terminology of the biosphere that we live in. Wade Davis has coined the term ethnosphere, meaning the world that each culture lives in, and talk just a little bit about colonial history and the rise of modernity and the modern self. Part of my intent is really to develop egalitarian exchanges with indigenous peoples, not exchanges that are appropriative, that take, and some of you may have heard about the issues that Native peoples have with when, drug companies come into, say, the Amazon and, want to copyright and patent medicines that they find there that they have used for centuries and centuries, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there's a big question, how do we do that, right? How do we learn, how do we exchange knowledge in a way that really is respectful? Our biosphere, which of course has all kinds of different ecologies, and I'm not going to say much about it. Anthropology has sort of done away with the notions that there are better and worse cultures, but really looks at each culture as a specific solution to ecological survival questions, to different answers to existential questions, different use of the imagination, you might even say. And in that frame, what we as moderns do is equally valued to what indigenous peoples do. However, there is a shadow issue, and I will talk briefly about it. So, this is what the ethnosphere looks like, not from the modern perspective, but from an indigenous perspective. Now, the first item is very obvious, right? All the animals, including the human animals, the plants, rocks, and stuff, are part of the ethnosphere. And then, the human cultures. Now, many indigenous people assume that there are also animal cultures other than humans, right? That they have a culture. And they also assume that not just humans dream, but rocks dream, trees dream, right? Very different worldview. And that there is something which is really hard to define, the ineffable, the numinous, the divine, aspects that are hidden from the everyday, and that is important. That's all part of the ethnosphere. And that is, a larger definition than we in the West would normally come up with, okay? So all of this connects with what at times is called the great memory, the great cycles of time. We might call it, in sort of a Jungian vein, the archetypal memory. But it's really synonymous with heightened or deepened consciousness. And it is through ceremony and ritual that we gain access to this great memory. Now, I will talk about this a little bit more in a minute. Accessing it is image-based. It's not so much language-based, it's image-based. And integrative states of consciousness, which I will talk more about, are central to that, a term that Michael Winkelmann developed. Okay, I'm going to move ahead here. Except I do want to read this. And I just mentioned very briefly, a lot of areas, I think it's over 90% of areas that have the highest biodiversity are also areas where indigenous peoples live today. So there's a very interesting overlap. This comes out of Kyrgyzstan, out of a sense of responsibility, and this is, I've done a little bit of work with snow leopard conservation, and I'm actually part of developing an app for shamans to count and document snow leopards. And the trick is not to do it just, okay, well, I saw a snow leopard, well, that's very easy, any biologist can do this. But from an indigenous perspective, well, did you have a dream about a snow leopard? What happened? Did a snow leopard show up in a ceremony, right? So it's a very different frame, and how do you reflect that in an app? Very interesting, especially when you deal with Western scientists who are biologists. Anyway, out of a sense of responsibility before our ancestors and future generations, we indigenous cultural practitioners stress the central role of snow leopard in the survival of humanity facing a civilization crisis which threatens our mountains with the cold breath of death. Meaning you take one important aspect out of the biosphere, out of the ethnosphere, and that threatens the survival of that ethnosphere and that biosphere. Okay, so that's the indigenous view of that. So colonization is really the splitting from the biosphere, from the ethnosphere, and I won't talk too much about that because there are a few other points I want to make. And this is very often, certainly in the US, sort of a shadow assumption that we find, right? Indigenous peoples are primitive. You know, Native Americans need to be civilized. You know, they're in need of development. And the Andean group Pratec, that deals with traditional Andean agriculture, has really criticized the notion of development, because what it really means is, oh, you got to be like us. You got to be in our modern self. You got to do this. Well, the Andes, for centuries and centuries, had very, very successful, very diverse horticulture going on. And if that culture persists, there's no need for development, okay? Okay, very briefly, I'm going to talk about the neuropsychology. Now, I want to emphasize something that I said earlier. I'm focusing on neuropsychology, but not because it provides an ultimate explanation. It does not. It is part of an explanation. It is part of an equation. But it shows how deep-seated our habits are, because we are really storytellers as human beings. Stories is all that we are. I want to briefly talk about three modalities: right hemispheric, left hemispheric, and integrative states of consciousness, or visionary modalities. Now, this summarizes research, and it's broad-based, broad categories. It's a broad map. It also applies to our self-perception, right? When you've probably all heard about Carl Rogers. He talks about the self-concept. Now, when he talks about the self-concept, it's something that is conscious, that we can describe, right? Who are you? And you can give a description of that. When you then talk about depth psychology, you get into the realm of the unconscious, and you include the dreams and your view of the self, and your self-perception sort of widens with that. But then we have also, and there's an interesting article, and Michal Hopal is here, that, and I can't pronounce the name, Frečka? Hopal and Luna wrote, where they talk about non-local, visionary, intuitive processes, you know, or integrative states of consciousness. So there's a third mode that we are also capable of, that is our potential. But the important point that they make is that actually this mode is very central to our sense of identity and our self-perception, and that is very important. That's something that Western psychology doesn't really talk about, because it kind of throws the paradigm down the drain. Okay, what I'm saying now is based on Ian McGilchrist's summary of all the research on left and right brain hemispheres. It's a tome that's this thick, about 100 pages of references in 6-point. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. It's an extraordinary book, very up to date. And it used to be that we thought, oh, this thing, you know, art is in that hemisphere and whatever, math is in that hemisphere, which is all totally false. But what is true is that the two hemispheres have qualitatively different modes of perception. So, his book is called The Master and His Emissary. The master is really the right hemisphere originally, which is the integrator, which is what connects us with reality, which tends towards flow, which keeps us engaged, which is open to possibility, which creates meaning, which makes things cohere for us, and it makes us present. Now, the left hemisphere is sort of the emissary. When we need to understand something, when we need to go into detail and analyze, that's what the left hemisphere is very good at, right? And that's, we become present through the right hemisphere, and we represent through the left hemisphere. And of course, the left hemisphere is very good at manipulating the world. We have categories, and we tend towards fixity. And we see things in isolation. And you can think about the weird personality that I described earlier, okay? Now, I'm not going to go. It's important to know that whenever we do anything, whether we think or whether we dance, both of our hemispheres are always involved, in different ways, but they're always both involved. Now, integrated states of consciousness, which get us into non-local, intuitive, visionary perceptions, arise out of the synchronization between the left and the right hemispheres, as well as a connection and synchronization with older and younger parts of the brain. I haven't given you a definition of the shaman, even though I've talked a little bit or alluded to shamans and shamanism. Here's a common definition that you find: socially sanctioned practitioners who voluntarily, intentionally regulate their attention to access information not ordinarily available. Think about that which is ineffable, etc., the ancestor spirits, etc., using it to facilitate healthy development and alleviate stress and illness among members of their community and their community as a whole. So it's done for a benefit. It's not just done like in the 60s in the Haight-Ashbury, oh, let's just drop some acid and see what happens, right? The changes in consciousness are intentional to help others. This here is Rolling Thunder, who I knew, and I'm not going to tell that story. Now, shamanic rituals, the shaman is kind of an exemplar of that kind of brain integration that I'm talking about. They know how to do this. They are particularly good at it. But they also help set the intentions. Think about the chant that I quoted from the Navajos or the Diné. That's a setting of intention of balance in that case. These ceremonies facilitate social attachments, interpersonal attunement, enhance social identity, because you become, you embody more being a Navajo. You understand more what it means to be a Navajo. So it enhances mythic connections. Of course, it also relaxes. Now, you might wonder, how does this all get communicated? And there's some interesting research, and I'm just going to give you one example, and there are more than 20 articles which basically, support this. This is research that Jean Achterberg did with the fMRI. Very interesting research, and she talks about distant intentionality and what happens to those who purportedly receive this distant intentionality. She worked with 11 healers, 11 recipients in 2 different rooms. They couldn't see each other. There was a barrier. The recipients were in the MRI. The healers, the shamans, for 2 minutes, they would do what they normally do, and then they wouldn't do anything. And then they again would do what their natural, healing technique is. And what happens is that in those intervals, when the shamans did their shamanic work, there were changes in the brain that synchronized, which makes no sense in Western science, right? There's no easy explanatory model that can say, well, oh, of course, this is how it happens, right? So, which means that Jean Achterberg and her collaborators had a hard time getting this published, right? So they said, oh no, the data are wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But you got it published. Here you see a summary of which parts of the brain are impacted, and I won't go through this, but it is part of the evidence for the efficacy of shamanic interventions. Now, with shamanism, I want to say just very bluntly, as with Western medicine at times works and at times it doesn't. Shamanism at times works and at times it doesn't. The interesting question is, when does it work? Under what conditions does it work? To understand that. And that's the research that we really need. Most shamans would say, I don't do any healing, it's the spirit that does the healing. So the shamans are really kind of the catalysts to get something going in the patients. I talked earlier about the synchronization between the older and the younger parts of the brain. We have here the model of MacLean's triune brain, starting out with a reptilian complex, those parts of the brains that, if we go unconscious, continue to function, regulate our blood pressure, et cetera, things that we don't want to think about, because if we had to think about them and we go unconscious, we would die because we couldn't set the intention, right? So it's good that we have this reptilian brain. The paleomammalian brain is kind of our emotional brain, broadly speaking, and then, of course, the neomammalian complex is where, what most people think of when we talk about the brain, where we make our decisions, where we think. Now, here's something very important. The neomammalian brain thinks in language, right? We reason. The emotional brain thinks in images, and that's where the shaman reaches. Now, the other part that's very important about the emotional brain is that's also where our habits are recorded. You've probably all had the experience, right? New Year's Eve, you set an intention and say, okay, my New Year's resolution is, right? And then what happens a week later? You didn't stop smoking or whatever it is that you decided you were going to do, right? That is because you were trying to decide something in language that really doesn't reach into that part of the brain. But through various altered states, and meditation is one of them, shamanic journeying, shamanic ritual, there are all kinds of ways to change our state of consciousness, that many traditions have practiced, including traditions here in Europe, that go from fasting to ecstatic dancing to hallucinogens or entheogens, et cetera, but they can reach into that place. And it's part of what we do every night, right? We go there every night. You do something incredibly creative every night. You dream, right? Which is extraordinary what you do there. You work with your images. And you've probably all had the experience, you remember a dream and you go, what the hell was that about, right? And because it is not the logic of your neocortex that is at work there, it's an emotional logic that we need to interpret and work with and understand. Now, shamans do dream interpretation a little bit differently, and that's a whole other discussion. Okay, I probably have only 5 more minutes. Yeah, let me go. So before we go to the video, indigenous societies or cultures and Western cultures took a very different route in terms of the use of the brain, right? What you find in the history of the West, which you will see here, is that the importance of the left hemisphere grew and grew and grew. And we are now in this scientific hall of mirrors where we know, as McGilchrist would say, more and more and more and more about less and less and less, right? And we are sort of in a closed system because we are so much in disregard of the right brain information. And that's, of course, what indigenous peoples to this day struggle to maintain. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said about all of this, but I think we're just going to show the video, and then we can discuss. So, is this the future of healing? You all know what these are, Prozac, right? right? And this is sort of the freeway going into New York, and you sort yourself according to the drug that you're taking, right? Or maybe we develop a more complex model of interventions. And this is actually something I'm working on for a textbook in abnormal psychology, really looking at all the factors that make a difference, that are part of psychological suffering and the healing of psychological suffering. All these are factors that are important. And they range from the stories that people hear, motivation, intention, to cultural assumptions, etc., etc. All of that makes a difference.